So good evening everybody, and welcome to the kickoff of the Alaska Historical Society's 2022 annual conference. I'm David Ramseur, president of the board these days, and let me start by noting that we find ourselves on the ancestral land of the Dena'ina people. And beyond that simple acknowledgement, our society believes the history of Alaska is the history of many groups and peoples who have shaped this place, including Alaska Native peoples as the first Alaskans. After 2 years of entirely virtual conferences, we are happy to see so many smiling faces in person at tonight's hybrid event, no doubt drawn by the reputation of our keynote speaker. Months ago, we had to decide on an in-person or another online conference, and so we had to anticipate the public health situation today. So that's why starting tomorrow at 9 o'clock, you'll see on the screen, we'll see you on the screen using a new platform, at least to us, Crowdcast. And an enormous thanks to the Anchorage Museum for helping us with that platform, for hosting us tonight, and for expanding our audience here through Crowdcast. And I think a number of people are tuned in tonight as well. So everyone who registered for the conference should have received instructions on how to log in for the next 2 weeks of conference sessions. And if you haven't received such a note, contact Cody Carver, who's operating the camera over here at the museum, and his contacts are on the inside cover of the conference program, which is available outside. And we're hoping we'll be able to return to in-person conferences next year, and we're already soliciting communities who are interested in hosting us. And if you represent a community with a rich history, like many Alaska communities, reach out to us and let us know of your interest. Before getting to our speaker, I need to give a few shout outs to those who helped us get here today. First, thanks to the Cook Inlet Historical Society for co-hosting tonight's event, and for turning out many of your members. And by the way, please consider joining either Cook Inlet or the Alaska Historical Society, or both. Thanks to the Atwood Foundation for their generous support for tonight's reception and for helping host our speaker. Thanks to the Alaska Humanities Forum and the National Endowment for the Humanities for a CARES Act grant that helped fund this and last year's conference. And thanks to our conference planning team, headed by Rachel Mason, who solicited, vetted, and organized several dozen individual presentations under our broad theme of conflicting visions of Alaska history. Now, if there's one thing we all know about Alaska, 2 words for everybody. If there's one thing we all know about Alaska, it's that Alaskans have strong and often conflicting views of both our history and current affairs. And it's that rich diversity that we celebrate with this year's conference. And we're thrilled that more than 100 people have registered for the conference. And let me put in a plug for 2 in-person tours that are part of the conference that have also been organized. Historic bar expert Doug Vandergraft is leading his annual tour of memorable 4th Avenue bars the evening of October 15th. That's not to be missed. And Anchorage's own senior curator of Alaska history and Indigenous cultures, Aaron Leggett, who's up here, will lead a tour of newly installed Dena'ina place name signs around Anchorage. And that's Saturday afternoon, October 15th. And you can sign up for both of these tours on the website. I also need to remind you of our annual business meeting at 2 o'clock on October 14th. We've got a full agenda of items on which we need approval of the full membership of the society, including the first update to our bylaws in more than a decade, which will allow us to conduct business in this electronic age. And I need to correct one minor glitch in our conference guide. Tomorrow at 4 o'clock is the panel about teaching the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act. We got it right on page 6 of the guide, the first reference, but we got the time wrong in the second fuller description, so just make sure you get that right. So now on to our speaker. When her book Floating Coast started getting laudatory national reviews a few years ago, I couldn't find it at my local bookstore, so I went to the library to see if I could get it there. But it was in such demand that the reservation backlog was months long which is pretty rare, I think, for a book on the Bering Strait. So I broke down and ordered it from Mr. Bezos and couldn't put it down. I was especially intrigued by her descriptions of life in parts of Russia most of us can't see from our houses, which are those along the Russian Bering Sea coast, where I personally have spent a lot of time. It's a fascinating read, and now is one of my go-to resources on Alaska-Russia relations. Our speaker has a limited number of books available for sale and signing in the lobby after the presentation. And to give our speaker a proper introduction, let me turn to University of Alaska Fairbanks history and Northern Studies professor, Phil White. Phil's academic focus is on environmental development, and he's written extensively on the Alaska pipeline and our state's economy. And he tells me he met Professor Demuth at an environmental conference some years ago, and she offered Phil, then a young PhD candidate, some sage advice about studying Alaska history. So we're happy to bring them back together. Phil found himself out of state during our conference kickoff, but I believe he's available for our introduction tonight of the keynote speaker. Phil?
Hey, David, can you all hear and see me?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. Well, good evening, folks, and thank you, David, for that very kind introduction. I'm sad that I can't be there with you all in person today. As David mentioned, I'm on the East Coast, and I'm actually helping my in-laws pack up their belongings and move to Fairbanks. So I consider the relocation effort my very small but very personal contribution to Alaska's economic development. It's of course ironic that our keynote speaker tonight is usually on the East Coast while I'm usually in Alaska. I think this dynamic actually reflects a core lesson of Dr. Demuth's work, the inseparability of the periphery from the metropole, the interconnectedness of Alaska in the far north from the urban centers throughout the world. Indeed, in Dr. Demuth's inaugural work, we see a very different Bering Strait than what is typically presented. This is a Beringia that illuminates the industrial guts and supply chains of the US East Coast and of St. Petersburg. She shows us that the demands of consumers and capital in distant cities have been the driving force of historical change in the far north since the 18th century. All of this is a long-winded way to say that it's my absolute honor to introduce our keynote speaker, someone who likely needs no introduction to a room of Alaska historians, Dr. Bathsheba Demuth. Dr. Demuth is an associate professor of history and environment and society at Brown University, where she specializes in the lands and seas of the Russian and North American Arctic. Her interest in the North began when she was 18 and moved to the village of Old Crow in the Yukon Territory of Canada, where she spent several years mushing, hunting, fishing, and otherwise learning the ways of the taiga and the tundra, or as I would put it another way, learning how not to die in the far north. Her writing has appeared in publications from the American Historical Review to the New Yorker. Floating Coast was named a Best Book of 2019 by Nature, National Public Radio, Kirkus Reviews, and the Library Journal, amongst others. A current Carnegie Foundation Fellow, she is working on a book about the environmental paths of the Yukon River. On a more personal note, as a professor who has assigned Floating Coast in numerous college classes, I must say that students find it a wonderful respite from the too often dry prose of academics. So on behalf of my students, thank you, Bathsheba. Professor Demuth's work is really at the intersection of three burgeoning fields and subfields. Floating Coast is certainly an exemplary form of environmental history, winning our field's top honor, the George Perkins Marsh Prize. Nevertheless, her work is far from orthodox thinking amongst environmental historians. Indeed, all Alaskans should be thankful that Dr. Demuth was bold enough to write Floating Coast after one of the most preeminent environmental historians told her the Bering Strait was a dead-end subject. Nevertheless, she persisted. But far more than embracing just an ecological view, Floating Coast also lies at the intersection of animal and energy history. Dr. Demuth demonstrates that we cannot understand change over time in the far north if we do not think deeply about non-human beings and the transformation of nutrients, calories, and joules. Astute readers come away from Dr. Demuth's work with a more capacious understanding of who might be a worthy member of our wider political nation and who, or even what, is worthy of rights. Such a perspective might encourage us to have a broader, more intimate relationship with the natural world and all of its beings, animate and inanimate. Finally, I want to return to this question of geographical distance in both livelihood and hearth. Alaska Governor Jay Hammond argued that an Alaskan wasn't simply someone who had their feet planted in Alaska, but more importantly, one whose heart and soul were affirmed in the North Country. Well, wherever Bathsheba Demuth is living and working, there is no doubt that she is a true daughter of the North. Please take it away, Dr. Demuth.
Well, thank you, Phil. I'm from Iowa, which means that praise of that sort is at risk of making me spontaneously combust. So if I catch fire on stage, it's Phil's fault. But truly, it's such an absolute honor to join you here this evening. To actually be in person in Anchorage, I was thinking that this is perhaps only the third time I've talked to an audience that wasn't virtual since 2020. And actually the last in-person talk I gave before the pandemic was at the Anchorage Museum, so this feels like sort of a meaningful circle. I would like to also thank David and Rachel for the invitation and all that goes into keeping a historical society running, to Joe, who managed all the logistics of getting me here, to Cody, who just manages all the logistics, and to the Bureau of Land Management, which gave me an artist residency this summer, which is where much of this talk was written. And I would also like to acknowledge once again that we are on the lands of the Dena'ina, and that I come to you from other lands. I currently live on the unceded territory of the Narragansett and Wampanoag in the state that we now call Rhode Island. But I was born on Ho-Chunk lands in the state of Iowa. And I didn't come up to this part of the world until I was 18. And when I did, as Phil alluded to, I lived in Gwich'in country in the village of Old Crow, just on the other side of the Yukon border, long before I knew what a professor did or what a historian was, or let alone an academic historian, or honestly, I didn't have any idea what a PhD was. And my job in Old Crow, which is really where we kind of get into tonight's talk, and the thing that I'm going to try to draw you into, which is the history between people and dogs, and use that as kind of a segue to talk about a more general approach to writing history that I think is compelling and useful for those of us who are interested in Alaska and its neighboring northern countries. Is that my job in the North was learning how not to die, as Phil said, on the back of a dog sled. And I cannot emphasize enough how steep that learning curve was. When I arrived, I did not know a husky from a corgi. I mean, I guess I did, sort of, but it was really a theoretical difference, not a practical one. And Stanley Najutli, who's the Gwich'in musher that I learned to dog sled from and who is now a dear friend, really had to start from scratch. And I still remember him telling me very explicitly that the #1 rule was to just hold on to the dog sled and not let go. Those were the marching orders. So one of my most memorable experiences of this experience of learning how not to die in the Arctic was that I came out of the dog yard with, 10 dogs on the line. My sled flipped over on a patch of ice right outside of town, and I did not let go. But the dogs kept going through Old Crow all the way in one direction, and then in case not every single person in town had witnessed me, the white girl, holding on for dear life, they turned around and went the other direction and drug me all the way back. So they taught me a lot, including to be extremely humble. But The dogs also taught me things besides grip. They taught me the language of their tails and their ears and their gait. They taught me which dogs preferred smoked salmon and which dogs liked moose liver. They taught me that some dogs like each other and some dogs don't. The two lead dogs, who, if you are familiar with mushing at all, are the ones that you ask to move right and left. You really implore them to stop, but they're not necessarily interested in it. Taught me to trust their senses, how they could see or feel or somehow intuit that a storm was coming before I could, or were aware of the presence of a bear in the kind of early seasons of spring when occasionally they came out of den too early. And that the dogs would sometimes know things far before I did. But I also learned that my entire being, my sort of capacity to move through the world, to not die, was reliant on keeping the dogs' trust. The first year that I was up in Old Crow, I went home for Christmas and I was gone for a couple of weeks. And when I came back in January, prime mushing season, and was ready to get back on the dog sled, I walked into the dog yard and every single dog there turned their backs and wouldn't look at me. So I hooked them up and they wouldn't listen to me. I had clearly broken some unknown bond between human and dog, and it took weeks of petting and treats and cajoling before they decided that I was back in their good graces. So they taught me very early on that I was dependent in a really kind of physically tangible way on the quality of the relationship between myself and the team. I relied on their canine work, their knowledge of the world, their fears, their desires, their joy, and in many ways, the strength of their attachment with me. And I'm offering this sort of brief sketch for two reasons. First, because all historians come from places and from people, and we build the stories we tell out of the past from those relationships. And mine are those of a longtime visitor and occasional dweller in Alaska and in Yukon and in parts of Siberia that at this point I don't know if I'll ever be able to return to on the Chukchi Peninsula. But I'm not able to go back at this point because of the war in Ukraine. But it's this part of the world, the Chukchi Peninsula and the Seward Peninsula, that's the subject of my first book. And then the second book that I'm working on, and the research for which I'm going to talk about tonight, goes up the Yukon River through all of interior Alaska out into what is now the Yukon Territory. The second reason that I'm introducing me getting drugged through town on my face by my dog team is that although I didn't know it then, the dogs have also given me kind of a way to approach the historical work that I do. And so what I'd like to do this evening is give an example of what kind of early colonial history along the Yukon River looks like if you take seriously the importance and necessity of dogs' relationships with people. And then I want to open up and talk about what that might be for telling history kind of beyond this one sort of situated example of humans and dogs interacting with each other. So, as I probably don't actually need to tell anyone in this room, Alaska's winters are truly transformational seasons, right? It takes landscapes that in the summer are full of boggy muskeg, sometimes outright swamp, places that are extremely difficult to travel, and turns them into significantly smoothed landscapes that you can move over. It freezes the rivers and turns them into kind of solid platforms on which you can move. And takes a major river like the Yukon and turns it kind of into an artery that threads inland from the Bering Sea all the way up into Canada. So the kind of capacity of snow to enable movement is a critical thing way back in Alaska's history all the way into the present. And that's as true at the beginning of the 19th century as it is later. And in this period, in the kind of moments that are antecedent to any European empire having designs or really any thoughts at all about this part of the world, the people who were moving along the Yukon River in the winter came from a wide range of indigenous nations. This is kind of the classic linguistic map of what's happening in Alaska in terms of the sort of incredible cultural and linguistic and political and social diversity along the river. This evening, I'm really only going to talk about sort of two indigenous nations, the central Yupik down at the Yukon River's mouth, and the Gwich'in up in the headwaters and kind of middle Yukon on the Porcupine down to the Fort Yukon area. And these are very different landscapes from each other in ways that are important. On Gwich'in land, it's kind of a place of lakes and low mountains and rivers, far inland, kind of a classic interior climate that gets extremely cold in the winter and can actually get darn hot in the summer, versus when you get down by the coast, there are very few hills, there's very few trees, it's a tundra environment running all the way out to the sea and kind of connected with that rich marine space in a way that's quite distant if you live upwards on the river. And because of that sort of difference in environment and difference in culture and difference in the ways that people choose to live in the places that they occupy and the ecologies that they come to know really well, Yupik and Gwich'in had very different traditions of living with dogs. Both people had dogs. Dogs were kind of important parts of both societies, but they had very different working kind of cultures with canines. Up on the kind of Gwich'in side of things, upriver, people had dogs, used them for hunting, used them as pack dogs. There aren't any pictures from the kind of early 1800s or the late 1700s, so these are later pictures of dog packs. And used them sometimes to line boats up rivers, so they would help pull boats, but they didn't pull sleds. This is not importantly for lack of exposure to dog sledding, which were moving around, where it had contact with the Inuit and Inupiaq and other peoples who mushed, but was a choice, right? There wasn't really a need to run dogs in big teams, but it's clear from oral histories that dogs were kind of integrated into people's lives and an important part of working with the landscape. If you go down to the mouth, down to Yupik country, in that big flat delta by the sea, Yupik have and had dog teams. So we're using dog harnesses, hooking dogs up, but mushed in a way that looks very different than the kind of Iditarod teams that probably everybody in this room has seen flying past on Front Street. In particular, teams were much smaller, like 2, 3, maybe 4 dogs in a family, and very often people pulled next to their dogs. Pictures like this one at the bottom here are quite common, where people are kind of in harness working with their dogs and would use the dogs to pull elders or to pull children, but generally speaking, you didn't sit on the back of your sled and just hang out. Moving across country was a big piece of work, and humans and dogs worked together. And critically, the Gwich'in and the Yupik work with dogs in ways that don't involve the kind of voice commands that I was trained to use in the 21st century, the jihad, right, left, please stop, let's go kind of set of commands. And partly, if you're thinking about Yupik mushing, it's because you don't need to command dogs that you're pulling next to, right? It's a sort of physically intimate relationship. And if you're using dogs for hunting, you actually have a whole other set of kind of ways that you want to communicate, because the task is very different. But dogs really enabled movement, particularly in Yupik country, where families would use their dog teams to pull sleds full of goods, sometimes hundreds of miles, to annual celebrations that kind of dotted the land in particular places. And these were moments of exchange. They're the places where you can swap your good sewing for somebody else's obsidian, or your ivory carving for baskets. You can dance and sing and learn new songs, you can get married, you can exchange stories and news. And these dog teams could hold 800 pounds over 10 miles a day with just 3 dogs. So these are pretty burly, substantial critters. And out of the oral histories, it's quite clear, both in Gwich'in country and down in Yupik land, that people's relationships with dogs were pretty intimate. They understood the things that I think are familiar to all dog owners, which is that dogs are individuals, they think about things differently from each other, they're not mutually interchangeable animals. And in one of, I think, the most poignant stories that actually comes from the kind of middle river in Koyukon country, the story of the way that dogs come to be domestic animals is that the figure of Raven, who exists in a lot of the cultural stories up and down the river, chooses not to allow dogs to speak like other animals are able to do in the historical kind of deep past of Yukon country, because if dogs could speak, they would be so close to people that their deaths would be unbearable. So this sense of having a sort of intense bond, like thank goodness we can't talk to them, because if we could, it would just actually end us, kind of emerges out of this story. So dogs are moving people around the Yukon River, up and down it, kind of crossways across it. They're moving trade goods long before Europeans ever kind of physically had a presence in this part of the world. They're moving knives and beads and other goods that are being traded kind of deep in Russian country all the way across the Bering Strait. They get all the way up into Gwich'in country. So they're kind of moving news of the outside world for a long time. And in the early 19th century, they start moving news of actual kind of foreigners arriving, both in Yupik land and up the river in Gwich'in country. And they're doing that because the Russian Empire and the British Empire had a very different sense of who controlled the Yukon River than anybody who actually lived there. They thought it looked like this. So if you contrast it with this map, which is what it actually, I mean, this isn't a political map, this is a linguistic one, but it gives you some sense of who is actually around. It doesn't look much like that. But anyway, there's this hard dividing line at the meridian, which was supposed to separate British territory to the east in what is now Canada from Alaska, which at the time was supposed to be owned by the Tsar. Neither empire, at the time that they make this very handy but completely sort of politically meaningless line on a map, actually had any physical presence in this part of the world, and want to rectify that. So the Russian Empire, represented by the Russian American Company, which is a sort of commercial subsidiary of the Tsarist government, moves across the Bering Strait, and by the 1830s is trying to establish a foothold at the mouth of the Yukon and then move upriver, with real designs on getting all the way up to that border with the British Empire. The Brits, meanwhile, are moving west across Canada with similar designs. And both empires kind of have this dual desire by sending out the Russian American Company and the Hudson's Bay Company, which is to assert those territorial claims, to actually put some boots on the ground in places where on a map they had made these assertions, and also to collect furs, which is probably no surprise to anyone in this room, that this is it's a kind of combined economic and colonial endeavor. And collecting furs really meant trading with the indigenous hunters who were able to gather the foxes and beavers and muskrats and martens and other really desirable pelts and trade with them so that they could be sent either back east through Canada or west across the Bering Strait, where the Russian Empire used fur basically as currency with China. So the Russian American Company and the Hudson's Bay Company, the Russians and the British, have these kind of dual tasks, to do some literal flag planting and also to extract money in the form of furs. And those furs, if you've ever spent any time with somebody who has a trap line, are very spatially dispersed across the landscape, right? Beavers build their lodges every couple of miles or quarters of miles. Martens and muskrats also are not necessarily condensed. Muskrats are maybe the most. Foxes, you have to move around to find them. So trapping requires moving. Hauling goods to trade for trapped furs, things like rifles and beads and axes and fabric and metal pots, all this also requires moving. And moving, as the Russian lieutenant L.A. Zaguskin, who's probably quite familiar again to many of you, writes in 1842 that any movement in this part of the world relied on the construction of sleds and the buying of dogs. So when Lieutenant Zaguskin describes this need for dogs, he was at what is now called St. Michael, down in the Norton Sound, which is a fort established by the Russian American Company in 1833. And 6 years later, they've moved upriver to Nulato. And from these kind of earliest ventures onward, kind of on the Yukon River, the Russian explorers and Russian American company personnel were extremely attentive to dogs. It's all over their records. And in part, this is because many of them had come to Alaska by spending considerable time on Kamchatka or other parts of Siberia, where they learned to mush from indigenous Siberians and kind of understood the importance of being able to move by dogs. So the correspondence is full of discussions of dog populations in Siberia, their health, different kinds of breeds in different parts of Siberia. They're kind of sending these back to St. Petersburg to talk about sort of the canine underpinnings of the imperial project. And dogs were, of course, critical to collecting the taxes or tribute that the Tsar was after out on the kind of front lines of empire. So the records are actually pretty robust when it comes to describing what people and dogs are doing. And because of all this attention, there's a lot of information that filters out of the Russian American company records about the real disappointment that the Russian kind of agents in Alaska have with Yupik dog culture. They see the fact that people and dogs will pull together at the front of sleds as a sort of profound inversion of an expected hierarchy. Instead of dogs doing exactly what people said, people and dogs were actually working together. And this sort of lack of a hierarchy is interpreted as a cultural lack. So Zaguskin writes again, quote, "Among the North American tribes, the art of travel with dogs is in its infancy. They have no lead dogs, no trained teams, and they never sit on the sled." Moreover, where people used pulling dogs, they tended to tie them, kind of wherever made sense on the front of the sled, 2 dogs each pulling out, sometimes 3 dogs in a fan hitch, use different kinds of hitches for different conditions. If you're moving over sea ice, you might want the weight distributed more. And this again was really kind of discomfiting to the Russian American company officials who wanted a straight line hitch like they had become accustomed to on Kamchatka. And so kind of set about basically a project of what they see as reforming dog use in Yupik country. Coming in the other direction, the Hudson's Bay Company, as they're moving east, has also learned about using dogs to pull sleds from indigenous mushers in eastern Canada. And so they arrive on the Yukon River actually quite habituated to mushing. They use the words G and haw for right and left, like is still quite common here in Alaska. And like the Russians, the Hudson's Bay Company really wants to transform how Gwich'in work with dogs. They're very judgmental. They're quite horrified that, quote, "the Gwich'in are still sunk in barbarism because the women are literally beasts of burden because they don't have domestic animals to, quote, help with the heavy work." And it's pretty clear from the ways in which the kind of British imperial voices are talking about this, that they see the Gwich'in as not having sort of sufficiently brought dogs along that kind of continuum from being wild to domestic. They're not sufficiently under human control yet, and so this is something that needs to sort of transform. Much as the Gwich'in did not have a habit of massively transforming the landscape through building things like roads or forts, they also had no tradition of massively controlling canine genetics. Gwich'in histories, however, really differ with this interpretation. The ways in which the British tend to emphasize the weakness of native dogs or their kind of unruliness, which in oral histories really kind of emphasize the fact that their dogs were incredibly strong. Hyacinth Andre, who's an elder who now lives on the Northwest Territories side, talks about how dogs could carry 4 caribou on their back, and that these are kind of incredibly strong animals, and also really emphasize their intelligence. So there's actually a lot of disagreement and conflict in the historical record between British accounts of what a dog is and Gwich'in accounts of what a dog is for. And there's also disagreement because the Hudson's Bay Company comes in and assumes that the Gwich'in don't mush just because they don't know about it. rather than seeing it as a set of sort of deliberate choices that were made to kind of make sense with the politics and culture and economics of the place. But if there is one thing that the British and the Gwich'in accounts really do agree on, it's that mushing dogs in a straight line is something that arrives with the Hudson's Bay Company. But this kind of mushing, the crossing ground with dogs, takes more than just owning some hardy canines. Humans and dogs have lived together for thousands of years. Some estimates by archaeologists go back to tens of thousands of years. Dogs have been domesticated by people in different parts of the world at different times, but at least 20,000 years ago, probably more, and in kind of different moments of domestication. So in China, in North America, in what is now Africa, in kind of all over the world, this relationship has built up between what were wolves and human beings. And that's a long enough period of time that human beings and dogs have actually co-evolved in some pretty critical ways. We are able to recognize each other across species, recognize individuals, which is not a given, right? It's not always easy to recognize one chickadee from another chickadee, but most people, even if you didn't grow up with dogs, can tell one dog from another dog. It's also true that most people, even if you have relatively little exposure with dogs, can actually sense or interpret canine emotions, right? They understand what a happy waving tail is, they understand what kind of threat postures are. And in turn, dogs are actually quite good at interpreting human emotional states. Anyone who's had a dog probably knows that they are quite responsive. If you're sad, they respond to your joy with kind of a mimicry of it. And this intensity of identification across species allows a kind of interspecies communication that's not unique to dogs. There's other species that this happens with, but it seems to be particularly strong. And it's also not universal. It's very much the case that dogs respond better and communicate sort of more fully with people that they've known for a long time. So dogs will come up to people that they don't know often and be quite friendly, but the ones that they really listen to and interact with tend to be people that they've known and people who provide a certain kind of consistency. And you can interpret that as care, you can interpret it as love, you can interpret it as just being there. But that kind of rapport between a human being who shows up a lot and dogs is something that behavioral scientists have actually spent a lot of time examining and have kind of come up with various ways that I do not fully understand of quantifying this relationship. But the sled dogs I worked with taught me this in a very practical and applied way that does not have any mathematics involved, which is good for me. And that is kind of goes back to that story of leaving for a couple of weeks and the dogs turn their back on you, right? They either are with you because you have been with them and you've been providing a sense of consistent care, or they might tell you that you actually need to shape up or they're not going to listen. And it's pretty clear. And it's also clear that when you have a good relationship with dogs, they respond in ways that can be genuinely beneficial. I fell off my dog sled at one point, and I realized in the course of this talk, I really only talked about me falling off. I did occasionally stay on the runners, I promise. I didn't realize that these were all stories of just total incapacity. But in this one case, I slipped and I hit my head with a snow hook, which is this, multiple pound hunk of metal that you try to anchor the team with, and it knocked me out, which is not a great thing to have happen. It's really bad for not dying in the Arctic to be knocked out and laying on the ground. And when I came to, the entire dog team, the leaders had pulled the dogs around and had circled up around me, and they were all like snooping and whining and pawing the ground and very concerned. And if you've met racing dogs, you know that if you just fall off, they usually keep going. So they were clearly aware that I had not just fallen off, that I was actually hurt. So I kind of use this as a form of interpretive evidence to the way that I approached the records that I'm now going to talk about. And that is, basically, it really matters how well your dogs know you and how well you know your dogs. This is like what allows you to move over all of that snowy landscape in the winter. And I think it's because I knew this that when I was digging through these archival records of the Hudson's Bay Company and the Russian American Company, And these are not records that I, quote, discovered, right? Like, I think there's a bit of a fetish for that in the historical profession, that you're just gonna go find some new document. These were not new documents. These are things people have written about before. But I was reading them with this kind of experience, basically of falling off my sled a lot, in mind, and thinking about the ways in which dogs respond to you. And what I realized is that the archival accounts were talking about something really similar. One kind of British member of the Hudson's Bay Company wrote that at first it was extremely difficult to make the dogs attached to you so that they would listen. And only with time did they, quote, do good service in transporting our goods. And Gwich'in oral histories kind of describe in a really robust way how it is that kind of long-term employees of the Hudson's Bay Company were always the best mushers. Stanley Najutli, who trained me to mush an old crow, and other folks in that part of what is now Yukon, talk about how John Firth, who's a Hudson's Bay Company employee who marries into a Gwich'in family and lived for decades at Peel River Post, was the person who really made mushing seem appealing in Gwich'in country, because he actually worked with his dogs really well, kind of modeled a set of relationships that let you move around the land. And it's kind of that makes mushing kind of a compelling thing to do. And it's also the fact that mushing, after the arrival of the Hudson's Bay Company, was compelling for economic reasons. It allowed Gwich'in families to go out trapping. There are quite a few accounts in the oral histories of the ways in which dog teams gave Gwich'in women, particularly women who might have been widows, to make a living because they could move around the country with their children, gather enough furs to get income at the trading posts, but also kind of participate in Indigenous economies at the same time. So they kind of move into Gwich'in life in ways that give people lots of agency. And they also make a kind of whole new sort of politics possible. The Hudson's Bay Company, by the 1840s, has a post at Fort Yukon. The Russian-American Company has a post down at Nulato. There's a lot of river in between, and most of the people going back and forth over that country are Gwich'in or Koyukon or Yupik, meeting in various places along that trail. And very quickly, people figured out that if you could get news of what the trading prices and goods were at the Russian post and ferry them up to Fort Yukon and tell the British, you could also do the inverse and go down to the Russian post and say, well, the Brits are selling me this for that many fox skins. And both the Russian-American Company records and Hudson's Bay Company spend a lot of time lamenting that they have terrible information, and really their only source is coming through people who have a very vested interest in what the prices are. So that you can drive a hard bargain if you have a good dog team and are able to move around. And it has kind of real political import, because it means that the two empires are kind of always at off foot, right? They don't really have control of the full spectrum of what's going on. And if you think about it, what's at the core of the kind of capacity for that sort of bargaining, the kind of playing these two empires off of each other, is the ways in which people are working with their dogs and are able to move over large swaths of territory pretty quickly in the winter. And at the core of that is kind of a caring relationship, and this is another thing that emerges out of the oral histories. As one elder from Fort Yukon noted, after a long day on trail, the first thing you do, quote, even before you have your own hot tea, is that you go look for your dogs, you take them out of harness, and you make a bed for them with branches, and you cook their food. And it was that kind of immediate care that allows the work to continue the next day. And you can see some of the ways in which dog mushing kind of takes off in culture very rapidly. The kind of creation of dog blankets, which are these beautifully beaded and tufted decorative garments that dogs would wear on holidays. People who had kind of particular standing in the community would dress their dogs. The Smithsonian has an amazing collection of these that should probably come back this way sometime. The Klondike that are just kind of these amazing garments that dogs wear. And obviously it's a tradition that has stayed as people are still brushing dogs in a style that's kind of goes back to that 19th century moment all up and down Gwich'in country. But the Russian archives actually tell a pretty different story. In 1836, the Russians decide that they're going to kind of have a full-on campaign of transforming the way that Yupik communities work with dogs. So they import trained lead dogs from Kamchatka. They bring over a trainer whose job it is to kind of instill good dog skills at Nulato Post. And they're really kind of focused on the idea that they should have large dog teams so that people are able to move over more territory and collect more fur and therefore bring more profit back to the Tsar. But as one observer wrote, the dogs were, quote, very practical and showed affection only for the man who feeds them. And that this meant that any change in staff at Russian posts was a problem. The dogs would, like the dogs that turned their back on me, not be particularly interested in listening to the new guy in town. And the Russian-American company had a lot of turnover. Zaguskin writes that, quote, the dogs never have time to get used to one man and are as baffled as the experience of the drivers as I am. And the result was tangled teams, a total melee of dogs all the time, animals that were doing anything but listening to their mushers, chewing their harnesses, and escaping into the night. So the Yupik mushers look at this and don't see particular reasons to adopt what the Russians are doing. It's not a particularly inspiring example. If you think about the job of the Russian-American company and the Hudson's Bay Company, kind of as colonial entities, their job is to take control out of land first and foremost. Along the Yukon, dogs were keys to doing this. And running dogs that were trained to heed human voice cues, both for the Russian-American company and the Hudson's Bay, was a sort of critical part of using canine labor to claim and maintain a sense of jurisdiction over space that otherwise, frankly, neither empire really had a hold on. And both found it an incredibly frustrating task. The kind of archives are filled with complaints about the boggy landscape, the mountains where there weren't bogs, the blizzards in the winter, the blizzards and mosquitoes in the summer, and this sort of consistent dependence on dogs that made both empires actually quite vulnerable. In some places, native nations prevented British expeditions from moving around by simply refusing to sell them or trade any dogs, or by, quote, an unwillingness or a delay in supplying the necessary food for the dogs. So shockingly, these communities weren't interested in handing their fish over. The Hudson's Bay Company actually built Fort Yukon inside what on that map was considered to be Russian territory, basically hoping that the Russians would never be able to actually get far enough up the Yukon to assert their claim in person. And it turns out that this works, in part because the Russians are consistently having trouble moving far enough up the river to do much at all. And that trade relationship, where the two empires are sort of consistently behind the times in terms of prices, means that all along the river, native peoples are able to trade for exactly what they want to and demand prices that, in the case of the Russian Empire, sometimes became genuinely ruinous. And both empires are extremely reticent to trade firearms with native people, but the ability for both empires to be played off each other actually meant that the trade in guns took off pretty quickly. The Russians start selling them because they want to buy dogs so they can move up the river to talk to the British, and the British start selling guns because they don't want to be outbid by the Russians. So the kind of end of this story is that the Russian-American company never actually makes it far enough upriver to go knocking on Fort Yukon's door. As close as they come is they send a letter that's actually delivered by Dogsled. And what interests me in this example is that it's a moment where we see history that is made not just by human political decisions, but by the relationships between people and the place where they worked and the animals that they worked with. And I'm offering this example not because I think every historian needs to go out and write about dogs, although I really do recommend it because it's a lot of fun, or even that you need to go write about animals. I'm offering it because I think that it's an example of what historians fundamentally do, which is interpret. The sources I used, as I said, are not particularly novel. People have read the Russian-American Company archive before. They've certainly read the Hudson's Bay Company papers. They've read the various other sources I talked about. The oral histories of dog mushing that I referenced have been circulating for more than 100 years. The thing that I did was that I just got up one day and I read them with a particular kind of relationship with dogs in mind. And I want to kind of end by talking about sort of history more generally for the real nerds in the audience. The best definition that I know of what history is comes not from a historian, but from a novelist. It comes from Hilary Mantel, who's the tremendous author of the Wolf Hall trilogy, which won a couple of Booker Prizes. It has nothing to do with Alaska. It's a retelling of Cromwell and King Henry VIII. And Hilary Mantel was kind of on my mind because she died a couple of weeks ago. And she wrote about history from the perspective of a novelist. She says, "Evidence is always partial. Facts are not truth, though they are part of it. Information is not knowledge. And history is not the past. It is the method that we have evolved of organizing our ignorance of the past. It is the record of what's left on the record. It's the plan of the positions taken when we stop the dance to note them down. It's what's left in the sieve when the centuries have run through it. A few stones, scraps of writing, and scraps of cloth. It is no more the past than a birth certificate is a birth, or a script is a performance, or a map is a journey. It is the multiplication of the evidence of fallible and biased witnesses combined with incomplete accounts of actions not fully understood by the people who performed them. It's no more than the best we can do, and it often falls short of that." What I take from this quote, first and foremost, is the necessity for humility, that no one person can ever write or speak the last word about the past, that we're all just telling a piece of it with the stones and the words and the scraps of cloth that we have at hand. The work, I think, is to keep on interpreting those scraps, turning them over and keeping them alive. I think that's part of the best that we can do. An interpretation, of course, starts with where you look, or where you listen, or otherwise apply your senses to the past. I appreciate that Mantel talks about the stones in that quote, because I think it's an invocation that there are things that matter other than just human beings in the stories we tell about the past. When I first came north 20 years ago, my expectations were very much disciplined by the education that explained nature's past, what you would call biology and ecology, very separately from human history, from culture and economics and politics. And it was a divide that endowed human beings alone with the power to make change. History in such a view is only in the scraps of cloth, and it's never in the stones. The stones are just for the geologists, and are the sort of passive thing that we all act upon. But that view is not the only way to see history. It's not, for example, the way that many Native Alaskan traditions tell their pasts, histories that are far more capacious than even my small attempts to read Dogsled back into the imperial borderlands. So I think to see history as only containing people is a kind of deeply colonial impulse, one that writes away other traditions and interpretations. It also brings me to thinking a little bit about conflict, which is, after all, the subject of this conference, and which I haven't really talked very directly about, although obviously any situation of colonialism is conflictual. But I have been dancing around a set of conflicts about who is in history at all. For a very long time, the discipline that I come from, the kind of historians with a capital H who rode into Alaska, usually from the part of the world that I now live in, had the same attitude, all apologies, toward Gwich'in and Yupik communities that the Russian and British did, seeing them as somehow lacking because their ways of life did not emphasize marking the land with roads or forts or mines or transforming dogs down to every tiny human whim. And in that colonial gaze, that kind of seeing the absence of scars on the land as an absence of knowledge or claim, are the fundamental kind of narratives of Indigenous dispossession. And so that body of scholarship, to which I am kind of in the lineage of, is also not particularly adept at bringing in a range of other kinds of human stories to Alaska history, from those of formerly enslaved people to Filipino immigrants, and sometimes even to just women, full stop, as an entire human category. But I also think that that kind of big H capital F frontier narrative writes out beings that are not human quite regularly. If not all people can be counted as historical actors, beings other than people surely have no space. But I think that those stories that strike a hard line between human history and the history of the rest of the life on our planet, stories that make all of nature and many humans the objects of conquest, are both fundamentally incomplete and are not actually working very well for us. Telling history as if people are independent from the animals and the ecosystems around us, imagining that we don't depend on relationships not to die, strikes me as deeply related to the cascading ecological crisis we now find ourselves in. So I think that retelling history that does as much as it can with the scraps that we have to think us back into relationships, conflictual or not, and to see ourselves as dependent on our dogs' moods as much as our own wills, is just one example of a whole world that is open to people who are interested in thinking about the past. And my task, as I see it as a professional historian who is half in and half out of Alaska, is to be part of doing that kind of translation, to welcoming people into stories that are perhaps not familiar, or familiar stories with new beginnings or new characters or new arguments. Most of all, I think it's the work of showing people the stones and the words and the scraps of cloth that we work from when reaching into the past, and welcoming a much broader community into that work of interpretation. And when we do that, there's going to be conflict, because in talking about history, we are asking the most essential questions of ourselves, about how we know things, about who we are, and what are our claims to place and to responsibility. And I can only do one very, very tiny piece of this task. It's no single person's job. It's a community endeavor, and I mean community as capaciously as possible. And many of those people are presenting in the coming days. We can see it on the program from Bill Schneider and Stephen Haycox, and Karen Brewster, and Charlene Fisher, and Mike Hawfield, and Jennifer Romer, and Michael Hoyt, who are all presenting on ANCSA. If you want to talk about a place where you probably need to think a bit about conflict. Spencer Abe on earthquakes, Sabina Allen on the vitality of oral history and the knowledge is within, Benjamin Yasuk, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that because my Russian training makes me see C's as S's, so it might be not a S there, who's talking about mission schools, Phil White, who you saw on screen, he's talking about the Hall Road to the pipeline, and a whole cast of others, including the historic bar crawl. I'm very sad that I'm not going to be in the state for that. But I'm offering these names and what they're talking about as an indication of how kind of vital and important this community of scholars in Alaska is. And I would also like to say, to me, the work of doing historical interpretation and kind of bringing in the capacious world that we live in and learning how to interpret in a way that brings forth the vitality of the relationships that we have, extends beyond the conference to all oral historians and public historians, professor sorts like myself, to community librarians, to people who paint murals and make museum exhibits, people who write for scholars, and people who teach youth. It extends perhaps to what dogs and mountains and tides and whales might teach us about history too. It teaches us to listen to all of those voices, and that is no more than the best we can do. Thank you. I think Rachel is refereeing questions. I welcome any and all about this talk or my first book, which actually dealt with Russia, mainland Russia.
That's great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Demuth, and I'm here to field any questions that you have. And actually, since I have the mic, I will I'll start with my question, which is, I wonder if the Yupiks or Wichin had names for their dogs, and if you could tell us anything about the naming and how that related to the colonial enterprise.
Yes, so folks definitely name their dogs. Some discussions of Yupik naming indicate that some dogs were named and some dogs just kind of went under dog. So sort of depending on how close they were with people. There seemed like there was sort of a category of camp dog that didn't necessarily do a lot of pulling and was maybe in some quasi-pest, quasi-loved relationship. We've all had that dog in our life, I think. But yes, definitely named, and named in the ways that, you know, anything from names that are quasi-human to names that are kind of deeply particular to dogs. The British Empire is interesting in that sometimes there's a lot of information about dogs being named and kind of loved and known as individuals, and then there's also some incredibly, like, very cold, like, today we ate the dogs kind of documentation, and so I don't know if I have kind of a summary judgment on how, you know, I think it depended on the circumstances and how desperate they ended up being to a large degree, and there certainly are cases of, you know, I think much like Balto, right, there are kind of these very well-known named lead dogs in Russian tradition too.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you. What other questions? Avril? What?
Thank you for your presentation. I was very interested in the fact that the white people who came to Alaska were confident that they knew better than the people who actually lived there about how to deal with Alaska and the dogs. And I wondered if you know of any similar prejudice. Is this just a various aspect of sort of white supremacy, or is it a natural human instinct? So did the Gwich'in look down on the Yupik, or the Yupik look down? I mean, is it just a human thing of looking down on other people who do things differently?
That is a really good question, and I feel like it's one, if I taught a 14-week course, we could probably at the end of it start to circle around and answer. So I will do my best in a constrained time period. The question for folks who are listening online is basically, was the ways in which the British Empire and the Russian Empire kind of dismissed indigenous knowledge kind of a factor of white supremacy, or is it just what people do when they run into new groups of people? And I think the answer is, in part, that because this talk was short, I gave a fairly simplified picture of what groups of people were doing, right? And on the ground, you actually have individuals in the Russian Empire and the British Empire who are actually quite cognizant that when they arrived in a place like Fort Yukon, that they really didn't know what was going on, and they were deeply dependent on sources of knowledge that came from the Gwich'in, or in the Russian case, from downriver communities. And I kind of glossed over those. I think it's also the case that if your mandate is to go take other people's land, and that's the job that you have been sent to do, you're probably inclined to think of them as not your equals, right? You kind of need to think that in order to carry out your job. And in some cases, you know, and I've seen this in different kinds of records in different places, from missionary accounts to Bolsheviks arriving, you know, on the Chukchi Peninsula. There are these moments where those expectations run into the reality of people from outside not knowing how to operate in this kind of new landscape, and understanding suddenly that they don't actually have a superior set of knowledge. And I don't know if it's universal. I think there is a way in which you see in all of these encounters, particularly in colonial encounters before power lines really harden, right? Before you have one side that actually has the upper hand in any particular way, where you just actually see a lot of curiosity, right? Like trying to figure things out, and certainly judgment that goes both ways, right? There are plenty of oral histories in Indigenous communities throughout Alaska that are totally appalled by certain things that outsiders bring in with them, like food in particular. Like, you look at the Yupik food names, like beans are things that make you fart. Banana is penis fruit. Like, these are not words that are saying, this is yummy, bring it in, right? Bread or flour has like some name for like dust you eat. I mean, you can kind of read into that there is some judgment going both ways. I think the tricky part is seeing the moment where that judgment hardens into a set of power relationships that allows one group of people to assert their claims over someone else and maintain those claims over time.
I can give you the...
Yeah, I was interested in the picture you showed of the dog blankets, and the lower part of the picture was Old Rampart House, I believe. Is that correct?
This is New Rampart, I think.
New Rampart House.
Yeah,
Okay.
I think that's the hill behind New Rampart.
What struck me there is I've heard accounts of people coming in at holiday time, at Christmas time, with their dogs festooned with these dog blankets and decorated. And that seems to indicate to me a special relationship with the dogs and their role in recognizing the individuals, their teams, and their competence in a sense. And I don't know whether in museums, whether you would find descriptions that would be helpful in elaborating on that.
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, this one, which is a really beautiful dog blanket that's at the Smithsonian, the amount of information they have on it is that it was purchased around circle from a Gwich'in artist. We don't have the artist's name, we don't know how it was used, and certainly if you were walking into a museum and you saw it, you wouldn't kind of know that, right, what that means, right? What it means to put a special blanket on your dog and think of your dog as, you know, a being that you would bead that for, right? That's an enormous amount of work, and it does indicate all of this care. So I agree, I think the museum interpretations, I mean, I think in part it's because these are objects that have not been repatriated, right? This is sitting in a vault somewhere in Washington. It's very distant from the peoples who made it. My guess is there's actually people along the river who could figure out who the artist was, or at least whose family it came from because of the beadwork, and you know that even hasn't been done. So, yeah.
You're going to have to give up your mic. What other questions do you have? David?
Very good.
A question about more contemporary issues. What long-term impact do you think the Ukraine invasion will have on access to Russia, just the ability to get to Russia, scientific exchanges, access to Russian archives, all the research that you've done?
Man, I was trying really hard to like actually have a history talk that wasn't purely depressing. And now I'm gonna really, I feel very bleak about that, honestly. I think that the hardening of senses of national difference between Russia and Ukraine and Russia and the United States are going to take a long time to repair, even if the war ended tomorrow. I don't think, my sense is I have friendships with people in Russia that are maintaining through this, and we found ways to communicate that kind of move around the state. And I also have friends who seem to really think that Russia is invading Ukraine to fight Nazis. And that just means that we live in two very different realities. And I really worry about what it means to kind of bring those back. And I think what that means for the research exchanges, I had like a tiny version of this compared to these, you know, multi-team projects that people working on permafrost, for example, have had and now don't have. So I don't feel very positive about it. I think it's going to be really difficult, and will take some real thinking actually on the part of people in the U.S. who want to rebuild those relationships to think how to do it when the opportunity arises. Like what is it going to mean to sort of bring folks who have been living in that different reality and who we might now have real reservations about back in? How do we also think about folks who are trying to leave Russia actively right now so they don't get drafted and don't have to participate in, you know, what some of my friends think of as war crimes. So I think there's a lot of complicated waters ahead, and I don't have much more of a crystal ball than that. And you probably actually know more than I do.
I have an answer to the previous question and another question. So the answer is, you want to do Russian research in Russian archives? Go there and do it. I came back 3 weeks ago. Russian consulate in Washington DC gives visas. You can fly. I flew through Finland. You cannot do it anymore. You can do it through Turkey. Archives are open to US citizens. I happen to be born in St. Petersburg, Russia, but I have US passport. I want to do my research as a part of an NPS. I uploaded in all my archival documentation. I was given full access to everything. So as far as technical accessibility, it's accessible. How you gauge your ethical standing? and your relationship with the past and ultimately the future is up to you. But the technical answer is yes, you can.
If you have an organization that will fund you, for like, I for example, am not allowed to travel. I can't spend any
Right.
Russians.
I
when
am
send
also not
Russians.
allowed to travel for NPS. I do it on my vacation.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's dirty answer. The question, it's kind of going against the siren call. And I love your writing, I love your history for unbelievable beauty and depth and humanity of that. I fully appreciate it and you articulated it. I'm curious though, when you start looking and kind of like peeling off the past, one of the things which struck me is, I'm a dog owner, I love dogs and all of that, but you look at Bering Strait history, you look at Chukchi relationship with dogs, and Chukchi perceived dogs as soulless animal. They were sacrificed left and right. That was an easy sacrifice. So, and this is just like, this is not my topic. So I'm curious, when you look back in the history of human-dog relationship around the Bering Strait and deeper in inland Alaska territory, how did you go in history and how does it change? Like, what have you noticed in kind of chronological changes of that subject?
That's a good question, and I think it brings up two things. One of which is that, I was talking about places where humans and dogs have had kind of explicitly non-conflictual relationships, in partly because of human cultural choices, right? Cultures that have decided that dogs are good critters to have around, and have kind of taken that emotional capacity that humans and dogs have and turned it into something that's really meaningful. And that's not a universal, right? There are many Islamic cultures, for example, where dogs are also really not, they're not animals that you'd bring into your house. They're not animals that you would consider to be soul-filled and kind of that you have a communion with. Not at all, right? And Chukchi are quite different than, other indigenous peoples in Russia even, who have highly different ways of interacting with dogs. So it's not a universal that we just get up one morning and you're like, it's fun to hang out with these beasts. I think in terms of change in the ways that people relate to dogs, that there's probably the biggest one is the move from dogs being extremely useful and critical economically in everyday life to dogs being recreational. And that's, it's kind of, the snow machine is probably the easiest kind of line of demarcation there. But there's lots of recreational use of dogs before that when you start having races and thinking of dogs not as purely work animals, but as animals that, you run in the fur rondy or the Alaska sweepstakes. And they bring you another kind of social prestige and capital by doing that, but it's not kind of the direct, like I need the dog so that I can go hunting, or I need the dog to haul wood. And that kind of relationship of dogs becoming more recreational has obviously only become more kind of obvious in the 21st century, where most people who have dog teams, some people use them for work, but they use them because they've chosen not to use a snowmobile. And I think that really does, that tends to move dogs more into the category, a little bit more in the category of pet, right? Like you don't have to have them around. And a little bit outside the category of like, we have to work together because otherwise, we can't get anything done. Not entirely, right? Like working dogs are still very different than corgis, as I learned. I think the other thing is that because dogs are no longer important economically, they're actually a drain economically. And so, you have to really decide if you want to have a dog team now that you're going to put an enormous amount of money into them. So instead of being a way that people had access to economic resources, they're now, they're like the lovely furry pit into which all your money goes if you have a dog team. And I think finally there's a chapter about human-dog relationships that's in the process of shifting because the climate and kind of other aspects of Alaskan ecology are shifting. So if you don't have fish to feed them along the Yukon, which has been the case, because the chum run has been a mess for the last 3 years, it becomes even more expensive to have dog teams, and therefore that recreational use becomes harder to pull off in a lot of families. And if there's less snow, right, the kind of rerouting of these major races, which is a major way of kind of maintaining this particular expression of human-dog relationships through mushing, that's another thing that's, we're just going to see more of, right? More moments when the Iditarod can't start where it wants to, or the Yukon quest is snowed out or snowed in. And so I think that is going to lead to another set of changes too.
I think we can have a couple more questions and then we better wrap it up.
I have a question specifically about dogs. Did you see any did any records show dogs were specifically bred for certain traits on either side of the, so to speak, political side?
The Russian versus.
Or the Gretchen versus the Yupik. Actual breeding for bigger dogs or faster dogs or whatever?
So this is a question that is actually kind of coming to light in real time, largely through archaeological evidence, because it's there are very differing accounts as to whether or not people were actually thinking about what their dogs were doing in the summer. A lot of them just sort of ran wild, and that meant that genetics were really out of the dogs. But there's also evidence, coming out of Siberia, 10,000 years ago, of dogs clearly being deliberately changing in pretty real time, right, in a way that looks like it's human intervention that are looking for particular traits like size. There's behavioral traits that might go along with that that don't show up in the record. So I think the answer is that it's becoming more clear, and it's becoming clear kind of at the nexus of archaeological evidence and oral histories, going back to sort of thinking through the ways that people were or were not caring about what their dogs were doing. I think there's certainly evidence coming out of all sorts of sources that people found individual dogs to have particular traits that they liked and would hope that dog had puppies. Whether or not that was, it takes a lot of coordination to make that happen. And so that's the piece where it really varies. But.
Thank you.
Right, okay, wait, one more.
Yeah, so my question is about gender. You mentioned the woman who was able to sustain herself and her family after being widowed by having a dog team and moving around and being able to get furs and pelts that way. I'm curious if there are gendered issues at play in terms of the dog teams as well, and the way that people interacted with their dog teams based on gendered relationships and sort of the colonial imprint that those would have in sort of interpreting potential gendered relationships as well.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. There's like a lot of examples of different kinds of gendered things that come to mind. And the first one is Stanley, who taught me to mush, really griping because he's like, I have to talk to my dogs in baby talk now because that's how you taught my lead dogs. He was really grumpy, I think, because there was a gendered comment in there. Interestingly, one of the things that both the British Empire and the Russian Empire were very critical of Yupik and Gwich'in society was about gender roles and not using dogs to work for women. So the way women were often working with dogs on these Yupik teams where people pulled with their dogs because women often raised the puppies, so they had the closest relationship with dogs and so could navigate the sea ice with them really well, or the river ice. And that was seen by outsiders as being kind of this example of like, you're making your women work like beasts, which of course did not come from talking to a lot of Yupik women, it came from sort of a set of assumptions. And there's a similar thing, the kind of not use of dog traction and dogs to pull sleds in Gwich'in country was seen as like, well, women could ride the sleds if you had bothered to domesticate your dogs. Again, not coming from like deep interviews with anybody. But the ways that people worked with dogs, like, Yupik women raising dogs, and there's lots of accounts of like tucking them into their jackets as puppies, and so having a very kind of close relationship, and that there's a kind of transference as dogs move to being kind of jock-line animals. And then it's just the person who works with them the most. So it could be a man or it could be a woman. but I think it becomes a little less gendered, perhaps.